Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started with introductions, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Lauren Withycombe with ASU Stardust Center for Affordable Homes and the Family. And the Stardust Center at ASU, we seek to connect the dots among housing, health, food access, transportation, even shade, to help craft regional integrated solutions leading to healthy and happy communities in our region. And it's my honor to introduce our moderator, Lauren Withycombe Keeler. And she's an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. She's also a senior global futures scientist here at the Global Futures Laboratory. And in her research, Keeler studies how different people with different professional responsibilities understand and make sense of the future and how futures are created through professional practice. Her work focuses on building capacity among individuals and groups to think about the future in ways that yield more inclusive and sustainable futures. With that, I would like Professor Keeler to take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Michelle Moore. Michelle Moore is CEO of Groundswell, a nonprofit that builds community power by connecting solar and energy efficiency with economic development, affordability, and quality of life. Moore is a social entrepreneur and former White House official with roots in rural Georgia. Her accomplishments range from developing programs as President Obama's federal chief sustainability officer that deployed 3.2 gigawatts of renewable energy for the US military, to developing LEED into a globally recognized brand as senior vice president of the US Green Building Council. Her new book, Rural Renaissance, Revitalizing America's Hometowns Through Clean Power, draws on her extensive experience and outlines how communities throughout America, especially rural America, can flourish with the benefits of clean energy. Before we begin, as a reminder to our audience, please enter your questions into the Q&A feature at any time. Lauren will feed them to me and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And we spoke with Michelle before we started the webinar, and she said she's very open to questions throughout her presentation. So feel free to send them as you're listening, and I'll interject and see if we can get them answered. So, welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It is wonderful to be here with you all this afternoon. A blessing to be able to enter into this conversation. And let me please also double down on welcoming your questions throughout my presentation. I think it is conversation and connection is so important, especially as we look at building energy futures together. And so I don't want y'all just to have to sit back and be quiet and listen. Chime in the chat all along the way. And I also just want to appreciate and kind of getting going here, the reference to futures and building futures and Lauren's work. And one of the themes throughout Rural Renaissance is how we build local clean energy futures together. And as my colleague and friend Ari Wallach describes, and Ari is a futurist as well, it's really about how can we all be great ancestors, which is such a beautiful and such a personal way to think about this work. So I am joining you today from my hometown of LaGrange, Georgia, which is a small town in a rural county, about an hour and 15 minutes southwest of Atlanta, right on the Georgia-Alabama line. And it's very deeply connected to my own story, my own personal reasons as well for wanting to write Rural Renaissance. And that's my grandparents. And I'm not a big slides person, but I am going to just share a couple of photos with you along the way. And this is my mama and my papa. And they all worked in the cotton mills their whole life. And so did my mama and papa Moore, for that matter. And, you know, growing up, staying at their house was a joy. You know, even to this day, it is still home to me more than any other place that I've ever lived. But my mama and papa Moore's, Knopp's house and Moore's house were like many homes that are particularly our lower income neighborhoods and rural communities live in. And that is, they were extremely expensive to heat and cool and keep the lights on. And in the 1970s, when I was a kid and staying over at their house, if it were cold at all, especially if it were cold enough to have to worry about keeping the pipes from freezing, my mom and papa would crank up the gas furnace, and the utility bill they would get at the end of the month was over $400. And on the pay that they got, it was absolutely backbreaking. Now, at the time, as a little kid, that wasn't something I thought a whole lot about. But I saw across my community and the housing that many of our neighbors lived in, that there were a lot of my neighbors who were worse off than my mama and papa were, who even in the 1970s were living in homes that were little more than shacks, and that had maybe a wood burning stove, who were washing their laundry in the backyard, and who had an outhouse even at that time in our country's history. And that image was always really seared into my mind. And when I was working for President Obama on sustainability, it just really struck me, and struck me in my heart that in all the years that I had spent, helping corporations, helping organizations be more sustainable, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and save a little money on their utility bills, which was important. And I'm grateful for that work to be able to contribute to the future that we all share. I'd never really done anything that would help my grandparents, that would help people like the people I grew up with in my hometown. And I made a commitment to really putting before myself people's well-being, and well-being of communities that didn't often get seen or heard when we talked about sustainable futures, communities like LaGrange and more rural areas, and how they could be a part of this clean energy future too. And as I began to research on rural renaissance, I was so inspired by the opportunity that I found. And this was in March of 2020, and the Inflation Reduction Act was not even a glimmer in anybody's eye, but we're going to get to why that is so powerfully enabling at this moment of transformation. Because back in the 1920s, 1930s, specifically in the early 1930s is when this all kind of came to pass. It built momentum and then, exploded into the electrification of rural America. And at the time, people living in rural communities, people living on farms couldn't even turn the lights on. And you guys are going to hear a lot of parallels to where we are today with renewable power and broadband in this. But in the 1920s and early 1930s, the dominant perspective in the US was that electricity was a luxury. It was not a gotta have, it was a nice to have for those who could afford it. And at the time, privately owned utility companies, many of which are still with us today, just with slightly different names, claimed that it was too expensive to run wire to the farms. That last mile cost too much. That sound familiar to anybody from a broadband perspective? But they refused. They refused to provide service to farms and didn't think it was a necessity. And so during the New Deal, FDR and his administration created some groundbreaking institutions, including the Tennessee Valley Authority in 1933, which is still the nation's largest public power utility. And they created the infrastructure for what are today more than 900 rural electric cooperative utilities. Now, our rural electric cooperative utilities are important to understand when we begin to unpack how do we use this extraordinary moment that we're in when our energy systems are being rebuilt and transformed to make sure that we're building the economic value of all of those transformations back into our rural communities and other communities that have been starved for resources, have been diminishing economically. Many of whom have been deliberately marginalized through racist policies, so that everybody can thrive together in this moment. And a couple of things about our rural electric cooperatives that are really important to understand as we think about, okay, what are the mechanisms for leveraging clean energy for a rural economic revitalization, for a rural renaissance? One is that our rural cooperative utilities serve an extraordinary percentage of the United States when we think about it from the perspective of the land. Public power utilities, and there are quite a few in Arizona, are part of that picture. Public power utilities are actually units of municipal government, so they too are nonprofit utilities. Rural electric cooperatives are also nonprofits. They're 501c12, so they really exist to be able to take the value of electricity and the value of the energy service that it provides and to drive it back in to community economic development. So those value chains are staying local. Our rural electric cooperative utilities, combined with our public power utilities, serve more than 56% of America's landmass. It's really an extraordinary scope. And they are also, very importantly, democratically governed. Rural electric cooperatives in a very direct way, public power utilities in a slightly less direct way, are examples of energy democracy when they're working in the way that they should. And energy democracy, ultimately means that we're in control of our local energy futures as well. I think that particularly coming from, 25 years at this point in sustainability and clean energy, we can hear especially the highly partisan fights over what our climate and energy future is going to look like that can take place on the national stage and really feel like we don't necessarily have any power or agency in building our futures, that the future is something that's going to happen to us when it comes to climate and clean energy. And that's not the case, particularly in rural communities that are served by these energy democracies, where every single member of a rural electric cooperative utility is not only an owner of that utility, they also have a vote in who serves on the board. Boards are elected from among the membership of the utility. And also those boards are governing. They can set the direction for the future, the energy future of the community. Similarly with public power utilities, while there's not always a governing utility board, sometimes those utilities are served and governed by a city council or by a county council. Again, there's just a very direct and very local connection to building our energy future in a way that flies in the face of what can sometimes be conventional understanding of how we get from where we are today to a local clean energy future that is really protecting our climate and protecting our prosperity and well-being for the times to come as well. The second piece I want to focus on as it relates to the utilities that serve our rural communities is that their business models are nonprofit business models. What does that mean? It means that instead of the models that we may be more familiar with for areas that are served by investor-owned utilities, public utilities that are governed by public service commissions, their jobs are, ultimately to serve the public and to strike this balance between the public good and private profits, because their ownership at the end of the day are investors. And while investors are not necessarily bad, and a shareholder-owned model can drive a whole lot of value and a whole lot of investment into our infrastructure, there's a fundamental misalignment of interest there, right? Like profitability for owners who live far away versus the quality of life for people who are customers of that utility that can really get out of balance. And so, when we think about local governance, we think about nonprofit business models that are focused on delivering local community economic development, there's extraordinary unrealized potential with these incredibly prescient institutions that were created 100 years ago to deliver powers to the farm, and that today can deliver clean energy and clean energy futures that are enriching rural life. Now, we have some particularly opportunities at this moment in time as well. And I want to talk just a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act in that regard. It was passed into law very recently, and it is the largest single investment in rural power that has been made in this country in 100 years since rural electric cooperatives were created. You guys have probably heard some of the headlines. It's more than $500 billion of investment overall. It includes $9.7 billion specifically for rural electric cooperative utilities to build clean energy futures, tax credits, tax rebates, incentives for electric vehicles, incentives for US-based manufacturing, incentives, grant support for building rural resilience. It's really an extraordinary menu of opportunity. And there are a couple of things in it that are especially important to highlight given where we are today. When we think about who the rural electric cooperative utilities are serving, there's some really tough economic realities that we have to understand. One is that rural electric cooperative utilities serve more than 90% of the persistent poverty counties in America, more than 90%. So who are rural electric cooperatives developing, communities for? They're really developing it for people who are struggling with multi-generational poverty and who are also struggling with some of the highest energy burdens in America. Energy burden is a measure of how much of your entire household income has to be spent to keep the lights on and to keep your house heated or cooled. Now, when we think about the research, 6% energy burden, so paying 6% of your total household income for your utility bill is considered to be unsustainably high. But in many rural communities around the country, the average energy burden, average, not the highest, but the average energy burden for low and moderate income households exceeds 20%, even 30% and 40% in many rural areas with cooler climates. Now, you're not supposed to pay more than 30% of your entire household income for your mortgage. So how are you going to pay for housing? How are you going to pay for food? How are you going to pay for medicine or healthcare when it's costing you an equivalent amount of your income just to keep power to your house? It's unsustainable.
Michelle, can I interject here? I've got a question just right on the
absolutely
topic. So
yes.
the question is, in Arizona, the rural electric co-ops have been historically resistant to renewable energy rules and seek exemptions, citing the lack of capital. So will the IRA and investments in rural electric co-ops change that dynamic? What are the kinds of opportunities that you see coming available?
Well, there's the money component of that, and there's the people component of that. So I'll address the money component of it first. So the Inflation Reduction Act does include an unprecedented amount of funding, specifically for rural electric cooperatives and for renewable power. And, I can't speak to the legislative intent, but the $9.7 billion that was included specifically for rural co-ops to build more clean energy is very closely aligned with the approximately $10 billion that many nonprofit research institutions identified as being needed for rural cooperatives to buy themselves out of long-term coal contracts, for instance, that were not necessarily even economically viable anymore. It wasn't the cheapest source of power for ratepayers anymore, but they were just long-term contracts that rural co-ops were kind of stuck in. So, one option that local cooperatives would have would be to use those funds that have been set aside specifically for rural co-ops and the Inflation Reduction Act to buy themselves out of those contracts, to be able to move to less expensive, much cleaner sources of energy. And I'm sure that we'll be hearing more from the USDA Rural Utility Service soon about how those dollars are going to be deployed. I also will, respond from a people perspective, because change is hard for most people. I'm someone who, I love change. I love to see things always getting better. And that can be the exception rather than the rule, especially when transformation in technically and financially and sort of physically as complex a subject as our energy systems are. And I think that there's some really important tools to keep in mind as it relates to cooperative governance. I'm from Georgia, and there have been a host of research reports that have come out pointing to some real challenges in rural cooperative governance. Statistics that demonstrate, for instance, that more than 90% of rural cooperative board members are male and white. And that's extremely, extremely far away from even closely representing the demographics of the region served by those cooperative boards. And there have been a lot of other instances that have been widely reported on of governance abuses, of the lack of transparent elections, lack of transparency in governing bylaws, instances of individuals kind of passing down compensated board positions to their children, and even, board members paying themselves a lot of money, significantly out of alignment with best practices and even out of alignment with income standards for the regions that they represent. So that's out there, but at the end of the day, if there are those kinds of governing challenges, in the rural cooperative where you live, they're powerful tools to be able to address those. And the most important one actually is the 7 cooperative principles themselves. And I will briefly just pop up an image of those. And here we go, the 7 cooperative principles. And you see that democratic member control and concern for community are among the 7 cooperative principles. Now, these cooperative principles weren't just made up by some trade association. They actually originated during the Industrial Revolution when worker cooperatives were first forming as a reaction against the extraordinary poverty and abuses, health and well-being issues that were being perpetuated by the way that many countries industrialized. And so these were really born from that worker movement at that time, and it's grown and built out since then. And these are adopted by tens of thousands of cooperatives all around the world. And these are at the core of not just the individual governance of cooperatives, but they're at the core of the tax regulations that determine how cooperatives are recognized as nonprofit organizations. And so bottom line, cooperative utilities have really beautiful bones. And if the cooperative utility that serves your community has digressed away from its founding principles, you've got an extraordinarily strong foundation here to bring them back to.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, comprehensive answer.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful question. Please keep them coming. The other component of the IRA, which is a terrible acronym, let me call it by its proper name, the Inflation Reduction Act, that I want to uplift is the tools that the legislation includes to really combat not just the extremely high energy burdens, but even energy poverty that's located across our rural communities. Some of the specific tools that the legislation has are tax rebates, tax credits for implementing energy audits, weatherization, all sorts of new electric appliances that can help reduce our energy bills, especially as natural gas prices are expected to go so high this winter. New air conditioning equipment that's much more energy efficient. And the tax credits or tax rebates, point of purchase rebates, rather, for people who are income qualified, total in the thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And it makes it, again, just an extraordinarily important moment for us to think about our local nonprofit, ideally democratically governed utilities and the role that they can play, not just in creating more energy efficiency, not just in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but really improving prosperity and quality of life and comfort and health and well-being, for our extremely energy burdened neighbors and rural communities. And one other lens I want to bring to that is we think about how we deploy, right? Like, how can we use all of these tools that we have now and that we have in this moment of transformation, this centennial investment in our rural communities? And that is the important need for reparative investments to create more housing equity in our rural communities as well. In my own hometown, where I'm sitting right now, the organization I lead runs a program called SOUL. It's called Save on Utilities Long Term. And it was created in partnership with the community, specifically to reduce electricity bills for our lowest income neighbors. And, our intentions were good. Launching the program 2 years ago, we thought we would run into some housing quality challenges, roof repairs and stuff that were necessary before you could get to energy efficiency. What we found, though, is that more than half of the homes that we went to, that we performed an initial energy audit on, were in such poor condition that they required thousands and thousands of dollars worth of repair and maintenance before we could even do simple weatherization. And I'll share some of the examples with you, not to be sensational, but just to give you a feel for how dire the circumstances are that many of our neighbors are living in. There were homes that had holes in the roof that were so long standing, and that residents were not able to begin to afford the repairs on, that led them to just shut the door. So there was just a room in the house they didn't use anymore because there was a hole in the roof. And the hole in the roof had been so long standing that there were plants growing up from the crawl space through the floor. We had instances with elderly residents, elderly homeowners, where there were persistent leaks in the plumbing in the bathroom. The sewer pipes were not connected to the city sewage, and we're just dumping sewage into the crawl space under the house. And the bathroom floor was so rotted that the toilet was beginning to fall through it. So very, very challenging housing issues that people were living with. And these didn't come up overnight, and they didn't exist by accident. You know, in this community, they were part of the legacy of segregated housing and policies like redlining. And so I would encourage, based on our own experiences, you know, anybody who undertakes an energy efficiency program in their community to think about that energy efficiency program as an opportunity for reparative investment in housing equity, you know, so that all of us and all of our neighbors are able to enjoy a healthy home that really respects quality of life and respects the dignity of all the people who live in our community. Obviously, solar, and especially in Arizona, is an incredible opportunity as well. I'm going to highlight two changes in the Inflation Reduction Act, from the Inflation Reduction Act, that create particular opportunities right now as well. One is that the solar tax credit, you know, has been increased again to 30%. So it increases the value of that credit. And there are all sorts of grant funds that are available to help build resilience. But a flaw in the tax credit up until this point, you know, from my perspective, from my experience, is that tax credits reward wealth with ownership. And it means that anybody in any institution that doesn't have wealth or doesn't have tax liability is kind of stuck renting and paying more for the same product, right? It's a policy flaw at the values level, when it's it's incomplete, right, on its own. But the Inflation Reduction Act made a very, very important change in the tax credit. It made it refundable for nonprofit institutions. That means for the very first time that churches, nonprofit organizations, nonprofit housing agencies that build solar projects can actually get the value of the tax credit themselves and get it as a refund. It's a powerful policy change that will lead to greater energy equity. And not only that, it also increases the value of the tax credit to 40% in communities that are considered to be underserved or under-resourced or energy transition communities. So communities that have really depended on fossil fuel extraction or fossil fuel, like coal-fired power plants and stuff, for their jobs and for their economic opportunity. So two really powerful changes that enable communities to realize more value, more equitable value from our energy transformation. I see I'll depend on you, Lauren, to bring the question forward at the right time. But as we think about how we deploy solar and how we deploy solar differently in different communities, because we are such a geographically diverse country, and everywhere we have a different abundance of natural resources and built environment resources that fundamentally shape, you know, the right way to deploy solar in our community. It's going to look different in Arizona than it looks in LaGrange, Georgia, than it looks in Baltimore, Maryland. Arizona has pioneered such an extraordinarily important innovation here that can benefit communities all over the country and all over the world. And it's led by Dr. Greg Barron-Gafford, and it's called agrovoltaics. And I'm also just going to show you guys a little picture of what an agrovoltaic installation can look like. And agrovoltaics answer a very important question. Here we go. And it's a question about land use, because there's some folks who've expressed concern about, hey, you know, what if we put solar panels on all of our farmland and we don't have anywhere to grow food anymore? Now, at the local level, that may be a question folks ask as they see, you know, farmland turn to solar farms. Although nationally, we would only need 2%, just 2% of our agricultural land to be able to generate enough solar power for the entire country. But agrovoltaics take it a step further. Agrovoltaics are an example of dual land use. It's a way to bring solar power into agricultural land in a way that helps the solar panels work more efficiently, produce more energy, and that can also help increase crop yields and even enable agriculture to continue on land where climate change means it's just too hot and dry for most stuff to grow anymore. And there's a beautiful example of this in practice actually in Colorado, somewhere called Jack's Solar Farm. But the science is pretty straightforward. And y'all's colleague in Arizona has really helped to illuminate this in some wonderful and some very accessible ways. Just lifting the solar panels up a little higher that you would normally install them, which has a little bit of additional cost. You put a little more steel in there than you would otherwise. Provide some shade to the plants that grow underneath, and also mitigates evaporation, from heat and sun during the hottest part of the day in particular. So it gives the plants a little more room to breathe. It requires a little less watering. And then for the solar panels, having plants underneath keep them cooler on the underside. And that helps the solar panels to operate more efficiently as well. I know my mama Napa and my Ainada always kept a kitchen garden. And down here we grow what they always call the three sisters. It was corn, running beans, and squash. And I like to think of solar panels as the fourth sister in this case. Although you'd have to get them really tall to plant corn underneath, but powerful innovation, and one that's a wonderful example of researchers serving rural communities, driving innovations that support rural communities and that really honor the agricultural heritage of our land. There are a lot of other ways to do solar too that exist at the community scale. This is an example of how community solar works. And again, our nation's energy policy infrastructure is a very complete example of federalism at work. From a policy perspective, we don't have just one clean energy future. There's not like one monolithic path we all have to take. Every state, and in many cases, localities or utility service territories have the opportunity to determine their own way forward, their own how, towards our shared goals and our North Star. And in many places, community solar is an option. And in fact, nationally, rural electric cooperative utilities have been leaders in developing community solar projects. And community solar is typically, a distribution scale project. So let's say it doesn't take up any more than maybe 10 acres, if that, or it may be installed on the roof of a church or a roof of a school. And the solar panels at this central, local location then share power, with nearby residences, with nearby businesses, transmitted through the utility grid, but delivering savings directly to the household. And especially in, in local communities, it is a beautiful way to share power and share savings among neighbors at the neighborhood level. And it has some powerful potential benefits for our rural electric cooperative utilities as well. Because co-op utilities often have to pay demand charges, which means, the electricity is the most expensive when you need the electricity the most. And being able to generate some of your electricity needs locally just means you get to keep more of your money at home. Bottom line, you're sending less money far away, you're keeping more money close to home.
So Michelle, I got two questions in the queue for you.
Great.
I'm going to ask
go.
Out of order though, because the second question that we just got is a little closer to what you were just talking about with the community solar. So the question is, this is from Matilda Kreider. She says, thanks so much for the session. I work on wind energy equity and community planning at NREL. And in my world, community ownership models for wind are never really discussed as a viable possibility in the US, despite their popularity in other countries. I'm curious if you believe community ownership of utility scale renewables will ever become a reality in the US. And if so, how can we get there?
Great question. Thank you. And also, I just want to give a little shout out to the extraordinary work that NREL is doing in all sorts of areas. In the area where you're working, we were grateful to partner with a team at NREL on a resilience hub in Atlanta. Y'all do beautiful stuff. So thank you for everything that you do. I will preface my answer by saying I'm a glass half full kind of girl. And so I think that all good is possible. And I think that we could achieve community ownership of utility scale wind and renewables if it's something that we decided to do. And there's some models that we could look to as well. particularly when we think about sponsor equity in distribution or in larger scale projects. And I'll use a specific example for this too. From a development perspective, clearly clean energy is different, but in many ways it looks a lot like real estate. Particularly it looks a lot like affordable housing. It's tax credit finance at the end of the day. And it's the tax credit finance model. We're just using different widgets, and it costs less per square foot to build than a new multifamily affordable housing building. And there's some spectacular examples of ways to use real estate investment trust models to support community ownership that are coming from the affordable housing world. Kresge Foundation has done some work on this that's been published. And I believe, and Groundswell institutionally believes, that it's possible to bring those models into the renewable energy space. And it's something that we're actually actively researching, and that will be building on some research that Groundswell has led on equitable solar financing that was funded by the Department of Energy. Based on what we've seen, the fruit that we've seen these models bear in the affordable housing world, we believe that it's very applicable in renewable energy too, where communities want to own their own power, and that the potential for those models to be portable is augmented by the refundability of the tax credit too. So if that's something that you're researching, would certainly invite you to reach out to me directly. And would be happy to go further into depth about what we think the potential is there. And we also believe that large scale renewable energy buyers have an important role to play in this too. And a couple of years ago, Groundswell did a research collaboration with the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. Back then it was named the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. I kind of love the name Reba. It always made me think of Reba McEntire. It's my grandma's favorite country music artist. But anyway, I digress. The result of the research that we did with SEBA, and again, I'll pop up a little chart for us here, showed some process approaches that large scale buyers could take to centering community, including potentially centering community ownership with the utility scale projects that are built based on their corporate PPAs, based on their renewable energy demand, because certainly a very, very significant percentage of the renewable energy that's been built in the US and globally in the past several years has been driven by corporate demand. Data centers require a lot of power. And this graphic represents a process approach to developing PPAs that corporate leaders can follow to create more community-centric, more equitable outcomes associated with those projects. SEBA has a continuing work stream that's a part of their Beyond the Megawatt initiative that's continuing to iterate on this with process tools and procurement tools that these big buyers can use. And I would emphasize that it's particularly important for rural communities to be a part of these conversations as well. I was in Fitzgerald, Georgia a few weeks ago, and the mayor of Fitzgerald pointed out that, there are a lot of solar farms in Georgia, South Georgia in particular, and they're not 10 acres or 100 acres, they're 1,000 acres. The biggest one is 3,700 acres. And so they're huge, huge pieces of clean energy infrastructure that are being built there. And the mayor said, he was not against solar, but he just wanted to see more of the benefits stay local, because that power goes straight to the Atlanta area. And it goes to large corporate buyers, especially big buyers with data centers that use a lot of power. And he wanted to see, hey, how about put some of those tech jobs here? How about share some of the savings that comes from large scale projects like that with the local community? And when we think about how a community-centric approach to project development, and then borrowing some financial innovations from our colleagues in the affordable housing sector can be applied, I think we have some process pathway and some innovation pathway to get to community ownership on the large scale renewable energy front too.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. And then I've got one more question.
Okay.
As so many jobs in rural communities are provided by small businesses, and they deal with many of the same challenges as rural residents, do you know what's available in the IRA for small business owners to be able to engage in the emerging green economy and save money?
There are, I'll highlight just there's so many, it's a 700-page bill. So I'm sure there are more opportunities, even though that just the ones that are on the top of my head. But there's a program that USDA has called REAP, because it's not energy if it doesn't have a nonsensical acronym, y'all. But Rural Energy for America program, I think is what it stands for. But REAP provides grants directly to rural businesses, including small businesses, as well as agricultural businesses, to deploy clean energy and also to deploy energy storage. And, solar panels, depending on what state you're in, can definitely help you save some money. But when you combine energy storage with that solar, you get game-changing resilience. Like, not only are you able to, operate your building or your facility more independently, if you will. There's more, greater self-reliance there. But also you're able to keep the lights on when the power goes off. So you don't have to worry about downtime. I was stunned in my research to discover that the US has more power outages than any other developed nation in the world. We have more and more of them every year, particularly associated with extreme weather. And when the power goes out, rural communities are out the longest, just because it's hard for people to get there, right? Less density, longer lines, harder to repair. Even though our linemen are heroic, right? That's not a comment about the people or about their level of commitment or their extraordinary work. It's just harder to reach. And building for resilience can help us there. The incentives for energy efficiency also apply to rural businesses. So anything to make your business more energy efficient is going to be there for you. If you want to buy an electric vehicle for your business, you got incentives for that too. But there's a program that I want to uplift that's a long-standing program at USDA, and it just really makes clear that the businesses of rural electric cooperatives is community development. And that is that rural electric cooperatives have the ability to borrow money from USDA that can be lent at 0% in a revolving fund, specifically for community economic development. So, these are all important opportunities, and they are all there and can help build rural power, in a way that's also revitalizing rural economies. It does take a little figuring out, right? Because there's so many different programs and so many different doors you can go into. It can get a little bit confusing, but that's what rural cooperatives are there for. And the opportunities in the Inflation Reduction Act, not just because of the legislation, right, but because of this moment of transformation in our energy systems that we're in, they are just too big to let them pass us by.
That is super helpful. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I know, so I've got your book right here, and I know your book is a great resource for people that are interested in the kinds of detailed answers that you're providing us. But I know, like, I've been a part of at least 3 different conversations where we've got folks full-time digging into the IRA to figure out what it means and how we might be able to make the best use of it. But if you're just somebody who's living in a rural community and you want to figure out how you can access IRA funds, or what sorts of benefits are available to you or your community, what resources are available that you could look to?
There are some now.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are more coming as more folks like you and me dig into those 700 pages. But if you just live in a rural community, if you're a rural small business, one of the best resources that's going out there is actually provided by Rewiring America. And I will bring it up I will drop it in the chat for everybody here. And Rewiring America actually shares a very straightforward calculator. Don't you love an online calculator, y'all? But you can literally just, you can type in your zip code, an estimate of your household income, how many people live in your house, and it will give you a list of all the tax credits and rebates that you may be eligible for. And they're substantial. It can also include rewiring your home so that you're able to electrify your home. So they've really thought about a lot of detail, of what's really necessary to build clean energy futures at the residential level. It's a wonderful tool, and it's definitely a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, while we wait for any final questions, the final point that I wanted to make for everybody, or the final kind of technology inspiration I wanted to share, is just to build out a little bit more on the opportunities associated with resilience. Because no matter where you live in this country, over the course of the past, this past summer, we've been hit with some challenges, right? I mean, it's drought like we've never ever seen before, extreme heat, extreme rain, flooding. Where you got too little rain or too much rain all at once, and it can be really devastating. And one of the things that we really need, particularly in our rural communities, that have been hit very hard, including agricultural and other impacts of all the extreme weather, is more resilience. And one way to build community-centric resilience, is to combine energy and solar storage. We've talked about it a little bit at the residential or small business level, but it's very applicable at the larger community scale too. And it has benefits for many rural electric cooperative utilities. Because it can help save costs. It reduce infrastructure costs is typically what it's called. And those reductions in infrastructure costs for the utility can be shared with members as a modest dividend, or it can actually be plowed back into the community. A wonderful example of this, and one that can be replicated anywhere, is what Curtis Wynn did when he was the CEO of Roanoke Electric Cooperative Utility. And Roanoke is in REC, is in a very long-term impoverished community located in northeastern North Carolina, sort of over towards the coast. And there, Curtis deployed a program that was working with historically Black family-owned farms to build community solar projects. So, call it 10 acres of community solar per project, with energy storage connected to it. And then with Curtis's leadership, Roanoke Electric Cooperative Utility used the energy savings from those projects that the utility realized and invested it back into the community, enabling more residents who struggle with their utility bills to implement energy efficiency. Now, when we think about how we connect all these dots, right? Because the technology solutions that I talk about in Rural Renaissance, energy efficiency, solar, resilience, EVs, and broadband, because broadband is an absolutely necessary component to building a clean energy future, there's a lot of complexity, right? In the Inflation Reduction Act, there's so many different programs and so many opportunities and so many ways to bring incentives into your projects that can be a little bewildering. The policy environment is kind of complicated. Sometimes making all the technologies connect can take some extraordinary creativity too. But it is absolutely worth your time. It is absolutely worth your effort, because not only do we all want to be able to bring this extraordinary transformation of how we use energy and the connection between our energy systems and our transportation systems to bear to make our rural communities and our small town places that people can stay and raise a family if they want to, right? You don't have to move away to get a good job. You can stay right where you are and stay close to your people. If you live in a city and you want a little bit more room, you can move to a small town and have a great business and raise a family if you want to. But there are also so many creative ways, just like the ways that Curtis demonstrated in Roanoke, just like the ways that Mark Casey demonstrated in Ouachita, and many, many, many other leaders all over the country who are already making a way, right? You just may not have heard about them. Because they're from small places and they're more focused on getting stuff done than they are on making news about it. But to be able to connect all these different value chains, right? Value chains from saving some money over here with solar and storage, value chains from reducing your family's electricity bill, that also yields local jobs, doing that work. That also means there's more money to spend on other stuff. Or even some of the bigger ticket items, right? That are part of bringing economic revitalization to communities through clean power. Bigger ticket items like attracting manufacturing. Those EV tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, you can't get them unless the vehicle was made in America. You can't get them unless the battery in that vehicle was made in America. You know what that means? Means a whole lot of battery companies and a whole lot of car companies are going to have to make sure their supply lines are right here. And that builds for resilience too. I mean, we've all experienced over the course of the pandemic how tremendously inconvenient, to dangerous it is that our supply chains aren't closer to home. So all of these are extraordinary opportunities, and there are plenty of people to help out there, whether it be nonprofit or wonderful academic institutions like ASU, or just colleagues, other rural people around the country who are trying to answer the same questions for their own towns, who may be a little further along the way, who are there to help, who are there to be colleagues, or who are just there so you can pick up the phone and commiserate a little bit when the going gets tough. There is a field of innovators who are focused on this and who really want to see rural America be part of the future that we're building, and to get beyond the places that we've been as we've just really focused on big greenhouse gas reductions and big investments, and realizing that small is really beautiful too.
That's a wonderful sentiment. So I just got another question from the chat.
Okay.
I recently read something about a family hard hit by Hurricane Ian using their electric truck, a Ford F-150, to power their needs, phone charging, electric cooking appliances, after the grid went down in their area. So do you have any input about this type of resiliency and potential for areas that are hit by natural disasters and extreme weather events?
I think it's a powerful example. There's one in the book actually of a young couple who had a Ford F-150 hybrid, and when the power went out during their wedding, they were able to use their truck to keep the lights on and keep the party going. So it's just even in a tragedy like Ian, with so much damage, damage to natural systems too, and so much loss of life. It's one more powerful example of why building for resilience is good for us all. And it's going to help us all weather the storm, right? While we're also working to build a more resilient future. And if we were all in person, I would ask for a raise of hands for, all of us who are Ford F-150 Lightning fans and anxiously awaiting when they start rolling off the production lines in Tennessee.
Yes, that'll be exciting. That'll be exciting. So I'm from the School for the Future of Innovation and Society, and one of the things that we talk a lot about is this idea of responsible innovation, that we as innovators need to take responsibility over the things that we create and what they do in the world. That is beyond our original intention. But you, in your book, you talk about a type of innovation that I hadn't heard of, and I love the term. You talk about courageous innovation. Can you tell us a little bit about why we need courageous innovation?
Absolutely. And I have to uplift my colleague and friend, David Mueller, who has since passed on, who was the first person I heard use that term and talked about it so rapturously. But, courageous as applied to innovation is important in my experience, just because change is hard, and to innovate, you have to be willing to take a risk. And sometimes that risk pays off. And sometimes that risk ends up meaning you get a little bloodied and bruised. And in either case, you're learning, you're helping your community progress, you're helping your society progress. And, in a time where as much opportunity as we have in clean energy, there's also a lot of, partisan fighting about it too. And being the first person in your community to step out and really organize and challenge your colleagues and your neighbors to be able to commit to building a clean energy future together can be hard too. So courage is something and strength is something that we all have to step up and express as we innovate too. Although I will give you an amen on the appropriate innovation, because everywhere is a little bit different, right? Like what we need and what we have to offer. And we've got to make sure that we're not copying models that don't quite apply where we live either.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that your description there has the innovation coming from the people that live in the place, right? Mm-hmm. So it's local innovation, and you're right. It's sometimes it's most challenging to confront your neighbors
Mhm.
you know, and the people you go to school with and go to church with about a change that needs to happen. So yeah, I really appreciate that concept.
Yeah, and I think it's you know, and that's really where we can have the kinds of thoughtful conversations that are necessary to find unity.
Mhm.
Because, you know, regardless of where we come from or kind of where our perspectives may be, we have values in common. You know, there are values that we share, things that we all want for our own lives, for our communities, and for future generations. And at the local level, you can have the conversations and discover those common values, and then use the things that we share to build around for a better future.
That's great. I think that's a perfect closing thought. Thank you, everybody, for the great questions. And thank you so much, Michelle, for coming and talking to us today. And I see Lauren put a link to purchasing your book in the chat. So everybody go out and check out Rural Renaissance and learn how you can contribute to courageous innovation through clean energy in your community.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Andrea, and it was wonderful to spend some time with everybody here this afternoon.
And thank you. We so value your participation today, and we respect all of the experience and that you bring to your role, just as an author and as a speaker. Mad respect. And thank you so much for this enlightening discussion. And thank you so much, Lauren, for hosting.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
I want to check in with you guys a year from now and hear about all the awesome projects that folks are doing. And if our colleague at NREL has figured out large-scale wind community ownership too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I saw in Oregon, there's a solar wind project that's sort of combined and integrated that's kind of making waves, shall we say. I'm in Oregon. It'd be interesting to see if we can have a combination of solar and wind in Arizona. But thank you so much. And we love our Island Press series that we're able to bring world famous authors to our virtual screens. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and see you down the line.